On a rainy November evening in 1992, Samuel Walton stands at the corner of 6th and Main in Hillsboro, Ohio. The pay phone's dim light casts a yellow glow as he fumbles for quarters, raindrops sliding down the scratched plexiglass booth. He needs to call his wife. His car broke down 3 miles back. This particular phone booth has stood on this corner since 1963. In 2 years, it will be gone. This is the story of how America's once ubiquitous public telephone network, 400,000 pay phones strong at its peak, vanished from the American landscape almost without notice, leaving behind only ghosts in the concrete. What happened to the pay phone? The question seems simple, but like so many artifacts of American infrastructure, the answer reveals itself to be far more complex than technology alone can explain. Some blame the cell phone revolution. Others point to the telecommunications deregulation that began in the 1980s. A few even suggest deeper, more mysterious cultural forces at work, as if America itself decided to transform from a place where strangers shared public resources to one where each person carried their private communication device. The pay phone story begins long before most Americans can remember, in an era when the concept of instant voice communication across distances still seemed like a kind of magic. When the first coins dropped into the earliest pay telephones, horse-drawn carriages still dominated city streets, and most Americans had never heard a human voice transmitted through wires. Nicholas Shee removes his hat as he enters the lobby of the American Bank building in Hartford, Connecticut. It's March 1, 1889, and outside, snow blankets the city. Shee, a 42-year-old insurance salesman, approaches what appears to be a wooden cabinet mounted on the wall near the bank's marble staircase. He deposits a nickel into the slot, and a panel slides open, revealing a Bell telephone. The attendant behind the panel connects him to his office. His call complete, Shee exits the bank into the winter air, having just used one of America's first pay telephone stations. These early public telephones weren't the standalone booths that would later become iconic. They were attended stations, usually found in hotels, train stations, and other public buildings. William Gray, a Hartford inventor, had patented his coin-controlled apparatus for telephones in 1889, eliminating the need for human attendance. In 1902, the first coin-operated public telephone installed in a bank by Pacific Telephone and Telegraph Company would begin the model for what would become commonplace, the unattended pay telephone. By 1905, there were approximately 25,000 pay stations in America, many still attended by operators. The technology was expensive. A 3-minute call could cost the equivalent of $5.10 in today's money, but the public's fascination with telephony drove demand for access points. Alexander Graham Bell's invention was transitioning from novelty to necessity, and the pay telephone provided the critical public interface to this emerging network. What's often forgotten is how revolutionary the concept truly was. Before the public telephone, communication across distances required literacy, planning, and time. A telegram needed to be written. A letter required days or weeks to reach its destination. The pay telephone offered something previously unimaginable: spontaneous, immediate voice communication for anyone with a few coins, regardless of social class or education. The Western Electric 233G model, introduced in 1907, featured the prepayment system still recognizable today: deposit coins, then speak. These early phones were often installed on walls, not in booths, and privacy was minimal. The iconic booth, that symbol of both connection and isolation, wouldn't emerge as a standard feature until the 1950s, when Bell's system began its massive post-war expansion. Throughout the early 20th century, the pay telephone remained a relatively exclusive service. In 1910, there were approximately 45,000 pay telephones in the United States, serving a population of 92 million people, roughly one pay phone for every 2,000 Americans. The Great Depression temporarily halted expansion, with AT&T's monopoly focusing resources on maintaining existing infrastructure rather than expanding public access. But beneath the surface of this nascent industry, societal patterns were forming around these communication points that would shape American life for decades. Urban residents came to rely on corner pay phones to coordinate social plans. Immigrants used them to maintain connections with distant family. Business deals were struck, affairs arranged, emergencies reported, all through the mediation of these public portals. Some locations gained reputations. The phone booth outside Maxie's Deli in Chicago reportedly handled more illegal gambling calls than any other in the Midwest during the 1920s. Police stakeouts of certain pay phones became common during Prohibition, as authorities recognized these communication nodes as critical to criminal enterprises. Jenny Maxwell was 19 when she began working as a Bell telephone operator in Philadelphia in 1942. Now 99 years old and living in a retirement community in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, she recalls how World War II transformed the role of public telephones in American life. The pay phones near military bases would have lines 20, 30 people deep, she remembers. Young men shipping out, calling their sweethearts their mothers. We'd sometimes break the rules and extend their 3 minutes if no one was waiting. Those boys, some of them never came home. That pay phone call might be the last time they spoke to someone they loved. The war years saw pay phone usage surge. With 16 million Americans in uniform, many stationed far from home, the pay telephone became a critical connection point. Bell System, operating under government contracts, installed thousands of new public phones near military installations, train stations, and ports. By 1945, the number of pay telephones nationwide had grown to approximately 150,000. After the war, as America entered its greatest economic boom, the Bell System, still operating as a regulated monopoly, embarked on an unprecedented expansion of telephone infrastructure. Between 1945 and 1960, the number of pay telephones more than doubled to over 350,000 nationwide. It was during this post-war period that the modern pay telephone booth emerged in its most recognized form. The Bell System introduced the iconic glass and aluminum booth design in 1950. Measuring 33 inches wide by 33 inches deep and just over 7 feet tall, these booths became as much a part of the American landscape as mailboxes and fire hydrants. By 1960, these glass houses of communication stood on nearly every other urban street corner in America. Rural gas stations proudly advertised "pay phone available" on roadside signs. Hotels installed banks of them in their lobbies. Airports dedicated entire walls to rows of booths. America was building a communications infrastructure based on shared public access points, a fundamentally different approach than what would emerge decades later. Some locations took on almost mythic qualities in their communities. The 4 pay phones outside the Greyhound station in downtown Memphis allegedly handled more collect calls than any other installation in the South throughout the 1960s. The booth on the corner of Haight and Ashbury in San Francisco became an impromptu information center during the Summer of Love in 1967, with volunteers answering it to direct arriving hippies to crash pads and services. What's often overlooked about pay telephones is how democratic they were by design. Anyone with a coin, regardless of class, race, or status, could access the same network as a business executive or government official. In a nation still segregated in many ways, the pay phone network was remarkably egalitarian. This accessibility would later become one of its vulnerabilities. Norman Sears joined Bell of Pennsylvania as a coin collector in 1958, emptying pay phones throughout Philadelphia's northwest neighborhoods. Now 85, he offers a perspective rarely recorded in official histories. Each phone had its own personality, he explains from his home in Media, Pennsylvania. Some were cash cows. The one outside the bus terminal might have $200 in coins every week. Others barely covered the cost of servicing them, but the system worked because Bell maintained them all, profitable or not. That economic model was key to understanding the pay phone's eventual decline. Under the regulated monopoly, profitable locations effectively subsidized unprofitable ones, creating near-universal access. Bell System, and after the 1984 breakup, the regional Bell operating companies maintained approximately 2.6 million pay phones nationwide by 1995, their historic peak. But long before that peak, the seeds of the pay phone's demise were being planted. The first tremors came from an unexpected direction, not technology, but regulation. In the pre-dawn darkness of January 1, 1984, AT&T divested itself of the regional Bell operating companies, ending the regulated monopoly that had built America's telephone system. Judge Harold Green's antitrust ruling fundamentally restructured how telecommunications would function. Among the many changes was the creation of a competitive market for pay telephone service. Prior to divestiture, virtually all pay phones in America were owned and operated by the Bell system. After 1984, independent operators could enter the market, installing their own phones and competing for locations. By 1990, nearly 30% of America's pay phones were operated by companies other than the baby Bells. Competition had predictable effects. Independent operators installed phones only in high-traffic, profitable locations. The regional Bells, still operating under some regulatory requirements, maintained less profitable phones but began to evaluate their economic sustainability more critically. The number of pay phones actually increased in the decade following divestiture, reaching that historic peak of 2.6 million in 1995, but their distribution was changing. Phones were disappearing from low-income neighborhoods, rural areas, and locations where usage had declined. Some say there was something deeper occurring, that America's relationship with public space itself was transforming. The same years that saw pay phones begin to vanish also witnessed the privatization of other shared resources, the decline of public transit, the replacement of town squares with shopping malls, the gating of communities. The pay phone represented a particular vision of American life, explains Dr. Judith Morrison, professor of urban anthropology at Northwestern University. It assumed that public resources should be available to all, that we had obligations to provide infrastructure for strangers. As that vision changed, the pay phone became increasingly anachronistic. But something else was happening too, something that would accelerate the pay phone's decline beyond what regulatory changes alone might have caused. On October 13, 1983, Motorola released the DynaTAC 8000X, the first commercially available handheld cellular phone. Weighing nearly 2 pounds and priced at $3,995, approximately $11,000 in 2023 dollars, the device was far from a mass-market product. That first year, only about 1,200 units were sold nationwide, yet something had fundamentally shifted. For the first time, the telephone was untethered from fixed locations. The concept of carrying your phone, rather than going to a phone, had entered American consciousness. Cellular adoption grew slowly at first. By 1990, only about 5 million Americans had cellular service, less than 2% of the population. Calls were expensive, coverage limited, and devices bulky. The average cellular call in 1990 cost approximately 50 cents per minute, far more expensive than a local pay phone call at 25 cents. The cellular revolution accelerated in the mid-1990s as prices dropped and coverage expanded. By 1998, approximately 69 million Americans had cellular service, about 25% of the population. That same year, the number of pay phones in America decreased for the first time since the Great Depression, dropping from 2.6 million to 2.4 million. The timing was not coincidental. As cellular adoption passed critical thresholds in different regions, pay phone usage declined proportionally, first in wealthy urban centers, then in suburban areas, and finally spreading to all but the most rural or economically disadvantaged communities. By 2000, with approximately 109 million American cellular subscribers, the number of pay phones had dropped to about 2 million. The pace of removal accelerated. In 2006, AT&T announced it was exiting the pay phone business entirely. Verizon followed in 2011, selling its remaining 50,000 pay phones to Pacific Telemanagement Services. Today, fewer than 100,000 pay phones remain in the United States, less than 4% of their peak number. They persist primarily in transportation hubs, on college campuses, in correctional facilities, and in low-income areas where cellular adoption remains incomplete. Some remain due to regulatory requirements, others through inertia or oversight. But statistics fail to capture what was lost in this transformation, the social and cultural significance of these communication nodes that once connected communities in ways both practical and mysterious. Some recall the pay phone as a lifeline in emergencies. During the 1977 New York City blackout, with home phones inoperable due to power failures, thousands lined up at pay phones, which drew power directly from the central office to check on loved ones. In the immediate aftermath of the September 11, 2001 attacks, when cellular networks were overwhelmed, Manhattan's remaining pay phones became critical communication points, with lines stretching blocks as people waited to call family members. Others remember the pay phone's role in personal milestones. Jeffrey Townsend, now 65, recalls driving to a pay phone outside his small Kentucky hometown in 1978 to call his girlfriend's parents and ask for permission to marry their daughter. "I was too nervous to use our home phone," he explains. "My parents would have heard every word. That pay phone gave me privacy for the most important call of my life." The pay phone also occupied a unique place in American film and literature. Superman's iconic quick-change phone booth, Neo, receiving his first call from Morpheus in The Matrix, countless film noir detectives making anonymous calls from rain-slicked street corners. Holden Caulfield's failed attempts to connect with anyone who understands him in The Catcher in the Rye. The pay phone represented both connection and alienation, a public space offering moments of private communication. But there was always something slightly uncanny about pay phones too. Urban legends circulated about phones that rang in the middle of the night on desolate street corners. Who was calling? Who were they trying to reach? Former pay phone technician Richard Mayers recalls, "I serviced phones in Omaha for 31 years. There was this one booth outside a closed-down gas station on Highway 6. Phone company wanted to remove it, but every time they sent a crew, something would happen. Equipment would break down, someone would get sick. Eventually, they just left it. Locals said it would ring sometimes at 3 a.m. Nobody ever answered." Similar stories appear across America. The phone booth at mile marker 27 on Nevada Highway 50 that allegedly received calls for people who had died in accidents along the road. The phone outside the abandoned Millhaven Sanitarium in Wisconsin that maintenance workers claimed would sometimes connect to conversations already in progress when they tested the line. While such stories likely reflect folklore more than fact, they speak to the mysterious nature of these communication portals. Unlike cellular phones, which we personalize and control, pay phones were shared spaces where the boundaries between public and private blurred. You never knew who had used it before you, or who might use it after. The economic factors behind the pay phone's decline seem straightforward. As cellular adoption increased, pay phone usage decreased, making many locations financially unsustainable. The telecommunications companies, no longer operating under universal service obligations following deregulation, responded rationally by removing unprofitable phones. But broader cultural shifts were occurring simultaneously. The 1980s and 1990s saw American cities increasingly concerned with quality of life issues. Pay phones, especially in urban areas, became associated with drug dealing, prostitution, and other illicit activities. Municipal governments that had once required telephone companies to maintain public phones now requested their removal. In New York City, Mayor Rudolph Giuliani's administration specifically targeted pay phones in its quality of life initiatives, removing hundreds from areas undergoing gentrification. Between 1995 and 2000, Manhattan lost nearly 40% of its pay phones, not primarily due to cellular competition, but to deliberate policy decisions. Simultaneously, America's concept of public space was transforming. Shopping malls replaced downtown business districts. Gated communities proliferated. Public transit ridership declined as automobile ownership expanded. The pay phone, a fundamentally public utility requiring shared infrastructure, seemed increasingly at odds with an America turning toward privatized, individual solutions. Technological, regulatory, economic, and cultural forces converged to create what appeared, in retrospect, like an inevitable decline. But was it? Other countries maintained robust public phone systems well into the cellular era. Japan, with cellular adoption rates surpassing America's, still maintained over 200,000 public phones as of 2018. Germany's Deutsche Telekom operates approximately 17,000 public phones for a population 1/4 the size of the United States. The deeper question remains, did the pay phone disappear because we no longer needed it, or because we chose a different kind of society, one where communication became private rather than public, individualized rather than shared? Perhaps the answer lies not in technology, but in the specific American context of the late 20th century. As trust in public institutions declined, as urban spaces became increasingly contested, as economic models shifted from regulated utilities to market competition, the pay phone found itself caught between conflicting visions of American life. For those who relied on pay phones, their disappearance represented more than inconvenience. it reflected a fundamental shift in who was included in America's communication infrastructure. The cellular revolution, for all its democratizing potential, required resources not everyone possessed: the money for devices and monthly plans, the credit history for contracts, the identification documents for activation. A 2011 study by the National Consumer Law Center found that approximately 19 million Americans lacked access to either landline or cellular service, creating what researchers termed communication insecurity. Many of these individuals had previously relied on pay phones for essential calls. Jessica Miller began working with homeless youth in Portland, Oregon, in 2005, just as pay phones were disappearing from the urban landscape. "When I started, kids could find pay phones to call our crisis line," she recalls. "By 2010, they were gone. We had to completely rethink our outreach model." Similar stories emerged across the country. Domestic violence shelters reported that clients could no longer make safe, anonymous calls. Elderly residents in rural areas lost emergency access points. Low-income urban residents found themselves walking further to reach functioning phones. As pay phones vanished, they left behind curious artifacts: terminal stumps of cut cables protruding from buildings, empty metal frames bolted to sidewalks, rectangular outlines of slightly cleaner concrete where booths once stood. In some cities, artists transformed these remnants into sculptures or miniature libraries. In others, they simply rusted, ghost infrastructures haunting the urban landscape. The last Bell System pay phone was officially removed from Prairie Grove, Arkansas, on June 1, 2022. Its location, outside a rural gas station at the intersection of U.S. Highways 62 and 170, had once represented the company's commitment to universal service, maintaining public communications access even in remote locations. Mayor Sonny Hudson purchased the decommissioned phone and donated it to the Prairie Grove Historical Society, where it now sits in a small museum alongside other artifacts of America's technological past. "I must have used that phone 100 times growing up," Hudson told the local newspaper, "when our home phone was out during ice storms, to call my folks when basketball practice ran late. I met my wife at a dance in Fayetteville and didn't have a way home, called my buddy from that very phone to come get me. If I hadn't made that call, who knows if I'd have got her number." Funny to think how different life might have been. The remaining pay phones in America exist in a strange limbo. Some are maintained by small independent operators focusing on niche markets: hospitals, airports, truck stops. Others persist due to regulatory requirements, particularly the FCC's mandate that pay phones be available in certain public interest locations. A few remain simply because removing them would cost more than the minimal maintenance they require. Walking through Times Square in New York City today, a visitor might spot one of the city's new Link NYC kiosks, futuristic monoliths offering free Wi-Fi, device charging, and web browsing, along with free domestic calls via a touchscreen interface. These 21st-century communication points, funded by digital advertising, represent one vision of the pay phone's evolution. But for many Americans, particularly those born after 2000, the pay phone exists only as a cultural artifact, something seen in old movies or vintage photographs. The physical experience of stepping into a booth, closing the folding door, depositing coins, and dialing a rotary phone belongs to a rapidly fading past. Former Bell System engineer Thomas Williams, now 78, sees deeper implications in the pay phone's disappearance. "The cellular phone represents an entirely different philosophy of communication," he explains. "The pay phone was infrastructure, built, maintained, and regulated as a public good. Your cell phone is a consumer product." That's a profound shift in how we think about connecting with each other. This transformation, from communications as public infrastructure to communications as private consumer product, reflects broader changes in American society. The same decades that saw pay phones disappear also witnessed the privatization of other previously public functions: postal services facing competition from private carriers, public broadcasting competing with cable networks, public parks complemented by private recreational facilities. What makes the pay phone story particularly poignant is how completely it vanished without most Americans noticing its departure. Unlike other technological transitions, from horse to automobile, from radio to television, from vinyl to digital music, the pay phone's disappearance generated little public discussion or nostalgia until they were largely gone. Perhaps this reflects the phone's liminal status, neither fully public nor fully private, a threshold technology existing at the boundaries of social space. Or perhaps, as some suggest, we simply traded one form of communication for another without recognizing what else was lost in the exchange. The pay phone represented something more than its technical function, argues Dr. Morrison. It embodied the idea that society had an obligation to ensure everyone could communicate, regardless of economic status. That basic concept, universal service, has been fundamentally altered in the cellular era. In rural communities, this transformation has been particularly acute. McKenzie County, North Dakota, once maintained 24 roadside emergency pay phones along isolated stretches of highway where cellular coverage remained spotty. By 2015, all had been removed, victims of maintenance costs and vandalism. The county's solution: signs recommending travelers ensure their cell phones are fully charged before departure. Yet even as the physical pay phone infrastructure has largely disappeared, it has left indelible marks on American culture. The phone booth remains a powerful visual symbol in art and media. Films continue to feature pay phones as plot devices, often as deliberate period markers or to establish characters as outsiders. The phrase burner phone, a prepaid cellular device used temporarily and then discarded, directly evolves from pay phone culture, where anonymity was an inherent feature. Some communities have found ways to commemorate their vanished communication points. In Prairie Home, Missouri, residents installed a non-functioning vintage phone booth on their town square in 2017, complete with an original Bell system phone. The booth serves as both memorial and meeting point, a recognition of the social function these spaces once served. In Manhattan's West Village, local historians documented the locations of every pay phone that existed in the neighborhood in 1995, creating a walking tour of communication ghosts that guides visitors to sites where phones once stood, accompanied by oral histories from residents who used them. But for most Americans, the pay phone's departure marked the end of a particular relationship with public space and communication. The ability to be simultaneously present in a physical location while connecting to distant others, once available only at fixed points in the landscape, became a continuous, mobile possibility. The need to seek out communication points disappeared, replaced by the constant connectivity of cellular networks. This transformation continues to evolve. As smartphones replace basic cellular phones, as social media platforms become primary communication channels for younger generations, the very concept of making a call has shifted from its original meaning. Voice communication, the pay phone's sole function, has become just one option among many in our digital repertoire. What, then, is the legacy of America's vanished pay phones? Some see their disappearance as simple technological evolution, the replacement of an inferior communication method with a superior one. Others view it as a case study in how market forces and cultural shifts can rapidly transform infrastructure once considered permanent. Still others find in the pay phone story a more troubling narrative about access, equality, and the changing nature of public goods. Perhaps the most accurate assessment encompasses all these perspectives. The pay phone disappeared due to a complex convergence of technological innovation, regulatory changes, economic pressures, cultural shifts, and changing perceptions of public space. No single factor fully explains its rapid decline. I think about those phones sometimes, says Norman Sears, the retired Bell System coin collector. For decades, they were how America talked to itself. Rich, poor didn't matter, everyone used them. Now we all carry our private lines, never have to share. Is that progress? Maybe. But something's different about how we relate to strangers now, how we think about public space. On a warm summer evening in 2023, Samuel Walton's grandson stands at the same corner of 6th and Main in Hillsboro, Ohio, where his grandfather once made that emergency call in 1992. No pay phone stands there now, just a faint rectangular outline on the concrete sidewalk where the booth once rested. He pulls out his smartphone, checks his location on a mapping application, and texts his wife that he'll be home in 20 minutes. The corner is the same, the need to communicate persists, but the means of connection has transformed completely. The public portal has been replaced by a private device. The shared infrastructure has given way to personal technology. So whatever happened to pay phones? Some say technology simply rendered them obsolete. Others argue economic models made them unsustainable. Many point to cultural shifts that made public communication points seem increasingly unnecessary or even undesirable. Perhaps it was regulations that failed to protect this public resource. Or maybe, as some suggest, their disappearance reflects a deeper transformation in how Americans relate to public space and shared infrastructure. The mystery of the vanishing payphone ultimately reveals itself to be the story of America itself in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a nation reimagining its relationship with public resources, technology, and the very concept of connection. The phone booth's empty outline on our sidewalks marks not just the absence of a communication technology, but the ghostly imprint of a different vision of American life. What remains certain is that something more than metal and glass disappeared from the American landscape, a particular way of navigating the world, of being temporarily lost, of making spontaneous connections, of sharing public resources, vanished along with those ubiquitous booths. And like so many transformations in our built environment, we hardly noticed until they were gone.